We got a couple quick things. I want to introduce our speaker this evening. Julie Jo Severson works as a freelance journalist, editor, and personal historian, helping individuals record their life stories. A fourth-generation, lifelong Minnesotan, she is still constantly adding to her local bucket list and sneaks in many excursions throughout the metro whenever she has the opportunity. A little bit about the book, and she does have some books up here for sale as well, so be sure to see her afterwards. While blending old world history with modern day relevance, local author Julie Jo Severson explores hidden and legendary gems throughout the region she's called home for most of her life in her new local guidebook, Oldest Twin Cities, A Guide to Historic Treasures, our topic for this evening. She also has another book up here as well, another book up here as well. Let's see. Yeah, from a tiny old magic shop, school magic shop, tracing back to 1899 to a sacred cave tucked below 450 million-year-old bluffs, Oldest Twin Cities plays homage to enduring treasures and the national wonders in our midst. Julie Jo is also the author of Secret Twin Cities. That's the other copy up there, other photo up there. A Guide to the Weird, Wonderful, and Obscure, great title, which she describes as a whimsical tour of the Twin Cities through the eyes of the unusual. Very intriguing. So without further ado, we welcome Julie Jo Severson.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for coming out and joining me tonight. And Emily, you've been so wonderful. What a kind invitation, and your communication throughout leading up has been so wonderful and uplifting. So thank you for that, and to the whole society, the Historical Society, for helping the rest of us appreciate all the hardship and joy and chaos of the path that leads to the here and now, for better or worse. Thank you. As Emily said, I've had a couple local guidebooks come out in the past few years. Hot off the press, April 1st, Oldest Twin Cities was released. And Secret Twin Cities was released in March 2020, inadvertently, right when our cities were shutting down due to the pandemic. Literally boxes of them showed up at my door the same week my kids' schools all closed, and I shoved them in a corner and said, who's going to want to buy a local guidebook now? But she's done okay for herself. I think of her as Oldest Twin Cities' sassy fraternal twin sister. But I've seen her on the shelves at the Capitol, at the Minnesota History Center, on top of a pedestal at the Mill City Museum, and best of all, stacked up against a Prince mug at the Minnetonka General Store. So those have all been exciting moments for me. And that one is a, like you said, through the lens of the unusual, a wider range of topics in that one, from the locations in the metro where you can stand exactly halfway between the equator and the North Pole, to antique farm, 10-acre, that the owner calls his junkyard with a sense of humor. It's a lot of fun. And I'm happy to say they've all pretty much reopened since the pandemic. So it's still a real relevant book. About a year later, I started working on Oldest Twin Cities. And I like to say old world history meets modern day relevance. I bring it to the now. And featuring those places I met that transcend generations, from the oldest Mexican restaurant and oldest magic shop to the oldest natural spring and oldest hiking trail. Bill Linke, author of several books on Minneapolis and St. Paul history and culture, and longtime columnist for MinnPost, wrote a wonderful and pretty in-depth column about Oldest Twin Cities in MinnPost earlier this month. I'm a big fan of his. I attended his book launch in 2019, hiding in the way back, because I didn't know anybody, and never would I've, in my wildest dreams, imagined he'd one day write a column about a book of mine. But I thought he did a great job at capturing the spirit of the book. In one paragraph, he wrote, Oldest Twin Cities is a fun guidebook to the Twin Cities' quirky history. The book is perfect for thumbing through on the coffee table or a local coffee shop. It's also a handy permission slip to get out of the house and explore. The best thing is that Severson does not take herself too seriously. She aims to get people to chuckle and embrace curiosity. Well, I would take that. I plan to read the introduction of Oldest Twin Cities, and then I have a slideshow. But first, I'll tell you a little bit about my background. I'm one of 9 children, born to parents of German and Irish descent. dad's side is mostly from New Ulm, and my mom's side mostly from Ortonville. My primary years were spent in Duluth until we relocated to the western suburbs of the Twin Cities as I entered junior high. After graduating from the College of St. Benedict, I worked for a decade in public relations until I stepped out of the traditional workforce to raise a family. I have 3 kids who are now 17, 20, and 22. So, but I got spoiled with the flexibility of a freelance career. So no going back. During that time, I slowly transitioned into my freelance career as a journalist and editor. On the side, I work with individuals to record and preserve their life stories. Preserving our personal histories for future generations is a longtime interest of mine, since I first recorded and transcribed my own parents' life stories, full of adventures, loss, perseverance, decades ago. They both passed away a year apart while I was working on these 2 books. So I'm beyond grateful to have their life stories now to pass on to my kids and grandkids. I think it's especially vital, especially now for this new generation, to feel as though they belong to a narrative bigger than themselves. As a journalist, I also feel that same passion for preserving those hometown stories that provide us with a deeper sense of place and a feeling of connectedness to the region we live in. And that is the motivating factor that went into writing these books, especially when it came to writing Oldest Twin Cities. Since the pandemic, and then the murder of George Floyd and the civil uprising that followed, working on Oldest Twin Cities was sort of therapeutic for me. I needed a reason to fall back in love with Minneapolis and St. Paul. And this helped. This helped as I experienced and learned more about the places, providing us with continuity while the rest of the world is changing so rapidly around us. When many of us are sensing a loss of community in this changing world, it can be good for the soul to experience those local places that transcend generations and offer continuity. An old-timey neighborhood deli, a vintage theater, an ancient landscape, a creaky floored general store that sells homemade peach pies at the back counter. You know which one I'm talking about. Learning about their storied legacies can deepen not only our reverence for bygone days, but also our sense of place in the present. Oldest Twin Cities turns back the pages of time through both legendary and little-known treasures that have endured wars, exploitation, the Great Depression, discrimination, fires, urban renewal, an unprecedented pandemic, and civil uprising. But the real stories are the people involved who've dreamed, hoped, struggled, sacrificed, made memories, and persevered. First, there are Minnesota's Native American residents who've been stewards of this land for thousands of years. Minnesota is a word derived from the Dakota phrase Minnesota Makoche, which translates to land where the waters reflect the clouds. The roots here remain strong, but their history and the tragic erosion of their culture have often been absent from the dominant narrative. Then came the surge of European and American explorers, fur traders, soldiers, pioneers, and colonists in search of land and economic opportunities, followed by waves of immigrants and war refugees from across the globe seeking to make Minnesota their home. Now the descendants of all groups carry the torch while navigating unsettling times. Today, over half of Minnesota's population lives in the 7-county Twin Cities metropolitan area. At the heart of it are, of course, Minneapolis and St. Paul, centered around the confluence of the Mississippi, Minnesota, and St. Croix rivers. It can be a bit of a struggle to describe where the Twins begin and end, but they are independent municipalities with defined borders and their own unique characters. St. Paul, our capital city, once a muddy river frontier town that became a transcontinental center for railroading, and for a time a haven for gangsters, maintains a historic ambiance. Meanwhile, Minneapolis, which grew up around St. Anthony Falls while becoming an epicenter for lumber and grain, has more of a sprawling big city feel. But wherever you stand in the Twin Cities area, history is resonant. I'm an observer, writer, editor, day tripper, and deeply rooted Minnesotan who believes that when it comes to the well-being of a community and its residents, a feeling of connectedness to places and stories that make our region distinct matters. The 85 vignettes in the pages ahead are mere glimpses of extensive histories. It's the nature of this type of book to provide concise descriptions, but brevity can't begin to do these age-old marvels justice. I can only hope that shining a light on these events and places might help rekindle an appreciation for the Twin Cities' rich, complex heritage and the good things going on all around us. I also add that there are custom Google Maps for both of my books of the locations at secrettwincities.com. Between both books, there's more than 200 sites, plus several more in the sidebars, Tonight, we're gonna be talking about just a smidgen. Mostly all this Twin Cities, but there's a couple that are super Twin Cities in this slideshow. These books are so linked in my mind. That there's no duplicative stories or sites, but so many of the places are connected and nearby one another. I want you to know also a portion of proceeds of all the books sold from my own inventory on my website at events I donate to Give Hope Minnesota, which is especially since 2020, they've been bringing back hope to the Twin Cities and bringing people together to serve those in need. It was launched by Brian and Sarah Ingram, who also own several restaurants in the Twin Cities known as the Purpose-Driven Restaurants, including Hope Breakfast Bar located inside a 150-year-old firehouse in St. Paul, which you'll read about in the book as well. So this slideshow takes you up on a brief zigzag tour throughout the metro. You know, I'm not going to spend any one long time on any one site. I started Bedote because I mentioned it several times in both books. I realize that when I'm talking to a group who are associated with a historical society, you know much more than the general population. So it's kind of difficult to cater my talk's different, but I do realize that you know all about Bedote and the significance of it. Many groups have no idea. Anyway, so anyway, I think of this as probably the most historic and cultural significant place in Minnesota. For the Dakota people, Bedote is where everything began, where everything began changing. According to Gwen Westerman and Bruce White's wonderful book, Minnesota Makoche, The Land of the Dakota, this is where their ancestors came from the stars to be on the earth. And we'll come back to that grassy point at ground level a little ways into the slideshow. South of Bedote, on the bluffs across from Fort Snelling and Mendota Heights, you'll find Pilot Knob, known to the Dakota as Ohe Yawahe, meaning hill, much visited. Has anyone in this group been to Pilot Knob, been to this bluff top? You have, yeah. The Dakota people here have been gathering at the site for centuries. One of the reasons it's the hill much visited is because they used it as a burial ground. Additional evidence that humans have occupied this land for a long, long time include 10,000-year-old stone and copper tools found in the area by archaeologists and the extensive complex of ancient burial mounds that once dotted the landscape. In the early 1800s, this elevated terrain with a distinguished knob-like formation was used by steamboat pilots as they navigated their boats upriver, since it was so easy to pinpoint, thus leading it to being named Pilot Knob. In 1926, Acacia Cemetery purchased Pilot Knob and started a landscaping project. And as a part of that, they removed the top 20 feet of the hill, including that knob. So that's no longer there. But this site was once considered a potential location for the territorial capital. It's also where the Treaty of 1851 was signed, ceding 35 million acres of Dakota homeland to the US government. At one of the overlooks on that bluff is a sculptural work of art by local artist St. Jones, a well-known multidisciplinary artist and advocate from St. Paul. As you can see, it consists of 7 blocks of carved stone arranged in a circle. These blocks represent the 7 major divisions or council fires, as they're called, of the Dakota Nation. After nearly becoming a townhouse development in 2002, the prominent bluff top was restored and added to the National Register of Historic Places in 2017. While standing on the bluff top, you get beautiful views of the Twin City skylines in Fort Snelling and the Mendota Bridge. And it's also a great opportunity for bird watching. It's right on the Mississippi Flyway. And from there, you can also look, if you look closely, see the very tip of the steeple belonging to Minnesota's oldest church. One is the historic Church of St. Peter. There it is. 5 miles from Pilot Knob is the tiny town of Mendota, enveloped by Mendota Heights. Mendota used to be called St. Peter. It's a name, and Mendota is a name derived from the word Bedote. Although Mendota has probably fewer more than 2,200 residents and only a couple stoplights, It seems like it has the highest concentration of historical landmarks in all of Minnesota. This charming structure, built in 1853, beautifully restored in the 1970s, is the only remaining church built in the territory before Minnesota became a state. It was where Fort Snelling soldiers often attended services. Here's the inside, featuring antique seating, original organ, and the baptismal fonts. Most of the services are held in the modern day church now next door, but they still hold some services here. Here's a photo of the same church in 1885. The structure was built by Father Augustine Raveau, if I'm pronouncing that right, using stone from a nearby quarry. However, there was an earlier structure. An earlier St. Peter structure was a 20-foot by 40-foot log chapel constructed in 1842 by Father Lucien Galtier of France, the first Catholic church priest in Minnesota. And the altar he built for that first church is on display at the modern church next door. And on a side note, can anyone tell me what else Father Galtier is legendary for? He's the one we have to thank that our capital city is not called Pig's Eye. That's right. He switched it to St. Paul. So from St. Peter's Church, you can just walk down the hill and go to Sibley Historic Sites. Mendota was first a gathering place for Paleo-Indians thousands of years ago. Later, it was a site for Euro-Americans, fur traders making their way up the river, including Henry Sibley, a fur trader and Army general who, as you all know, went on to become Minnesota's first state governor in 1858. In 1834, Sibley took over management of the American Fur Company at Mendota. While there, he lived and worked in this limestone house built on a lovely landscape across from Fort Snelling. Sibley's home did duty as a private residence, business office, and a hotel for individuals visiting the area. It's now operated by the Dakota County Historical Society. And the site is home to 4 other of Minnesota's oldest buildings, including the former home of fur trader Gene Baptist Faribault, the home of Sibley's former private secretary and a cold storage unit. Front side of the house. It's often referred to as the state's oldest private residence. Sibley lived in here for 28 years. He first lived there as a bachelor, then with a Dakota woman named Red Blanket Woman and the daughter. After they separated, he then lived there with Sarah Jane Steele, the sister of friend and business associate Franklin Steele, a guy referred to a number of times in all the cities for his role in several land deals. Sibley did do a lot of good for the state, but his role in the U.S. Dakota War of 1862 and its dark aftermath, including the hanging of 38 Dakota men at Mankato, is still one of deep grief and controversy. Although he was known as a friend to the Dakota while a fur trader, Sibley was appointed commander of forces by Governor Alexander Ramsey to fight against. Not many people know about this gem, but if you walk around the back of the Sibley Historic Site on the gravel road, you get to this. At the dead end, you'll get to this bridge, and this is actually the Sibley Ferry Stone Arc Bridge, built in 1864, making it the state's oldest railroad bridge. Tracks above are now abandoned, but this tunnel leads you right to the Minnesota riverbank. You can see the river. Look close in right there. And if you were to go through the tunnel and turn left, that trail takes you all the way to Fort Snelling State Park, which then leads you to Pike Island. I feature Pike Island more in Secret Twin Cities. The name of the island, of course, traces back to when U.S. Army Lieutenant Zebulon Pike negotiated a treaty in 1805 that led to the Dakota ceding 100,000 acres of their homeland on which to build Fort Snelling. The pathway around Pike Island is a 3-mile hiking loop that passes by the Minnesota River on one side and the Mississippi River on the other. At the loop's halfway mark, you'll reach this grassy point as the 2 rivers combine into one, where we saw it from an aerial view in the very first slide. I don't need to tell this group again that Pike Island was also the site of the very dark chapter in Minnesota history following the U.S. Dakota War of 1862. When 1,600 Dakota people, mostly women, children, and elders, were crammed together within a wooden stockade during cold winter months. At the edge of the parking lot at Fort Snelling, you'll see the memorial dedicated to them. From Fort Snelling State Park, though, then if you want, you can just climb up the hill and visit Fort Snelling. And there, of course, is a round tower, the oldest Euro-American building in the state, constructed in 1820. I was really surprised to learn that in the 1930s, the round tower was converted into a residence with windows for the family of Thomas Markham, who was electrician for the fort. While living there, his wife ran a beauty shop from it. One of the daughters was quoted in the Star Tribune as saying it was big enough that you didn't feel like you were living in a circle. It has since been restored to its original form with rifle slits instead of windows. And situated between Fort Snelling and Minnehaha Park, you'll find Coldwater Spring. It's at least 10,000 years old. Spring. It's the last natural major spring in Hennepin County. It's a Dakota tribal sacred site. During the construction of Fort Snelling, U.S. soldiers used the area surrounding the spring as a temporary encampment because of its fresh water source. And to the Dakota people, Coldwater Springs, or Minne Owaissee, has long been known as a place of healing, gathering, and ceremony. The property was last home to the Bureau of Mines, Twin Cities Research Center. Today, the National Park Service manages the area as a protected historic site within the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area, and there's beautiful trails everywhere around there. It's just another perspective looking through the spring house there. This was when I visited in the spring. Beautiful at that time. I visited again in the fall, it was a little muddier. So go in the spring if you can. And this is the same site in 1900. Now, next door to Coldwater Park is Minnehaha Falls Regional Park. You can stay parked and just walk over to Minnehaha Falls Regional Park, where you'll find this hugely important historic relic, the John H. Stevens house. Unfortunately, you may have heard in the news that several fires nearly destroyed it last summer in the fall. I'm hoping it'll reopen eventually as a museum. But built in 1850, it was the first authorized house on the West Bank, originally located where the Minneapolis Post Office now sits. And has quite a legacy under its roof. Is essentially where the city of Minneapolis was dreamed up, organized, and named. This was, as a historical marker outside, explains the civic and social hub of the settlement that became Minneapolis. The house has been moved 4 times. Same house. In 1896, a campaign to save it that began in the pages of the Minneapolis Journal culminated in thousands of school children pulling it across town in relay teams and bringing it to the Minnehaha Park to keep it from getting demolished. The Junior League of Minneapolis, which restored the house in the 1980s, called the move the earliest example of historic preservation in Minneapolis. One of those school children was interesting to learn, Joseph Zalewski, who later co-founded the Hennepin County Historical Society, become a pioneer of historic preservation in Minneapolis. So being a part of that as a child must have had a big impact on him. A couple months prior to the fires, I was lucky enough to get to take a little self-guided tour all by myself through the house. The rooms inside are simple, but packed with exhibits and artifacts, explaining the key players and events that shaped Minneapolis' earliest years. There are photo albums and scrapbooks everywhere, including images of John H. Stevens and his wife Helen there. And they were known as the father and mother of Minneapolis back in the day. Stevens received permission from the U.S. War Department to build the house on the West Bank, which was part of the Fort Snelling military reservation at the time. In exchange, he operated a ferry across the river in the infant town of St. Anthony. Stevens and his wife Frances initially lived largely alone on the West Bank in this home, alongside Native Americans who occasionally set up camp there, as they had for hundreds of years. Members of the Dakota and Ojibwe tribes were frequent guests at his house. Among them were Little Crow, Good Road, Great Eagle, Shakopee, and the Dakota chiefs. Minnehaha Park is also the endpoint of the oldest hiking trail in Minneapolis. It winds through the gorge on the west side of the Mississippi River, following what was once a Native American trail. It is mostly hidden and remains unknown to many longtime city residents. The trail is not always easy to identify. Some segments join the paved parkway trails above the bluff, but in other areas, the trail dips far below. I do provide specific directions in the book for a good place to hop on. Near the North Trail entry, you'll find a large taconite boulder from the Sabi Iron Range there. It bears a tablet noting that the trail is named in named in honor of Newton Horace Winchell, a geologist who came to Minnesota in 1872 and became the first person to map Minnesota's geology. Time to head over to East St. Paul to one of my favorite dines, the biggest meatballs around, Russo, the cornerstone of the Paint Baylor neighborhood since the Great Depression. The whole place is like a mini museum, preaching walls covered with historic photos and dramatic paintings. The restaurant's founders, Francesco Russo, was born in a small village south of Rome. He and his wife Dora were parents of 14 children, immigrated to St. Paul in 1904 and opened Russo's, initially called Square Deal Cafe in 1933. Russo's was actually home to St. Paul's first bocce ball court, and as a result, it became a hotspot for the Italian men living in Sweet Hollow, a former immigrant shanty town hidden 120 feet below street level, right across from Russo's. You'd never know it was there unless you knew it was there. You can access Sweet Hollow through this historic tunnel tucked away just a few blocks from Russo's. I include directions on how to get to that tunnel from Russo's. It's a little windy. I do feature this in Secret Twin Cities, but I also mention it in all the Twin Cities in my Russo story. But for those who've never been to Sweet Hollow, there's a sneak peek to what you see when you walk through that tunnel. Since the 1970s, the area was cleaned up and turned into a lovely park. For nearly 100 years, though, from the 1860s to the 1950s, it was home to various immigrant groups who lived in little shanties. There's no electricity, no stores, no plumbing. They built outhouses on top of the creek. In 1956, the city declared the area as a health hazard, evacuated the families, and burned it all down. If you didn't already know, there was even an opera created about the story of Sweet Hollow. Through Sweet Hollow, you see the trail there is the Bruce Banjo Nature Trail. If you go north, you're going to pass the backside of Ham's Brewery. If you go south, you'll reach the Bruce Banjo Nature Sanctuary. Named after congressmen who advocated for the environment, the Bruce Banjo Nature Sanctuary is one of the most interesting and perplexing sites that I've learned about while working on these books. It's a 27-acre oasis bordered by highways and railroads, located just east of downtown St. Paul at the base of 450 million-year-old bluffs. It's also home to the oldest documented cave in the Midwest, which I'll talk about in a minute. Before this land was desecrated in the mid-1800s for industrial use and then used as an informal city dump, this site was a vibrant floodplain where Minnesota's native inhabitants lived, held ceremonies, and buried loved ones in nearby mountains. Thanks to a Native American-led coalition, the storied landscape is slowly being restored. Above the bluffs is Indian Mounds Regional Park, where you'll find 6 prehistoric burial mounds believed to have been constructed by Hopewell Native Americans 2,000 years ago. Dozens more were raised by developers. At the far east end of the sanctuary, tucked into the bluffs, with fresh water still trickling from it, is a cave across from a pond, now protected by a steel gate it's on the National Register of Historic Places. The picture on the left is from 1875, prior to the original entrance being destroyed to make room for the railroads. To the right is what it looks like now. It's known as Carver's Cave to many, but the Dakota's place name for it has long been walk-in teepee, which essentially means a few interpretations, but dwelling of the Great Spirit. Jonathan Carver, a European map maker who lived there with the Dakota people in 1766, wrote about it in his journals. He describes a great cave. He writes about a lake within the cave and extensive rock art at its entrance, representing ancient stories and spirituality. But again, that rock art has since been destroyed. A new walk-in teepee center is scheduled to open sometime in 2024. The date keeps getting pushed a little bit near the entrance to the sanctuary. Okay, with the sanctuary, and I'm really looking forward to learning more about the legacy of the sacred landscape when it does. Now let's head to St. Paul's West 7th corridor, often dubbed the West End. We head southwest just past Xcel Energy Center. You'll find St. Paul's oldest neighborhood, Irving Park, with the beautiful fountain, the center of it all. After this land was donated to the city in 1849 by land developer John Irving, who established upper landing for steamboats, The area quickly gathered stately homes and notable families, including Alexander Ramsey and his wife Anna. Ramsey, of course, served as Minnesota's first territorial governor and second state governor. Although he directly contributed to the founding and growth of Minnesota, it's important to note that he also played a major role in removing the area's indigenous people from their homelands. Once the Great Depression hit, the area started a slow decline. Even the original fountain was scrapped for metal. The fountain has since been replicated. While a number of the mansions were torn down throughout the decades, other historic homes were transferred there from around St. Paul to fill the void. And today it's just a pocket full of peacefulness. Usually when I go there, I have it all to myself, right in the heart of St. Paul. And nearly every home around that park has a story. It's the Alexander Ramsey house. 3 generations of Ramseys lived there until it was willed to the Minnesota Historical Society. It seems like it's really open. I don't know if it's open since COVID yet. And I was born, that was the date. This is one of my favorite houses there. I don't know, the Justice, I love the story, the Justice, I think it's Ohio mansion. He performed the nation's first successful gallbladder surgery at St. Joseph's Hospital in 1886. He was also the one to donate Harriet Island to St. Paul when it was public baths there. He built this home in 1889 to resemble the home where his wife August grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. Tragically, that same year they moved in, she died in childbirth, and so did the baby. Around the corner, you'll see Casetta Park. Charlie Brown, I guess he's called Charlie Adiamo Americano. He's a tribute to the area's early day Italian immigrants. The park is named after Michael Casetta, who opened the first Italian market in 1911, now a 40,000 square foot, 3-story emporium on West 7th, owned by the 4th generation. Nearby Irving Park is just so many historic places, obviously along West 7th, the oldest commercial corridor in the city. This is St. Paul's oldest commercial building. Love a good before and after. Former lager saloon, transformed into Waldman Brewery 2017 by St. Paul resident Tom Schroeder. I'm sure many of you know that he received a lot of wonderful press. In the years leading up to the Civil War, this is where German immigrants, often entire families, gather around tables to play games and gossip and smoke and drink cold lager beer in small wooden rooms lit up by whale oil. Inside, Tom has restored it. Beautiful details of the mid-1800s. Wood stoves, virgin pine floors and doors, hand-blown glass windows, steamboat chairs, bulb maps and paraffin lamps. No whale oil anymore, though. That's too expensive. Have a great beer garden now. It's just a really friendly hangout in St. Paul. Year round out there. They have heaters and share rings. And he called me right away and ordered 20 books to sell at this bar. I was like, oh, wow, okay. And right next to the adjacent to Waldman Brewery is Smith Avenue High Bridge, a local landmark originally constructed in 1889, reconstructed in 1986. If you're brave enough to walk across the pedestrian pathway provided, you'll get what local journalist Andy Sturtevant calls a God's view of the city. The bridge connects St. Paul's West End to St. Paul's West Side, which to confuse people even more is south of St. Paul. The West Side is home to St. Paul's most active Latino community and the Metro's oldest Mexican restaurant, Boca Chica. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go way over there today in the slideshow, but you'll read about a couple gems in the book. You'll find that every wall tells a story of Boca Chica, known for Grandma Fria's homemade pork seasoned tamales. It's a great place to go after you go take a ghost tour at Wabash Caves, a gangster tour. While I'm in the West End, I usually try to go down to the Upper Landing Park to take a stroll. It's a great place. The views of the city, the river, and Harriet Island right across from it. I once read that if cities have a spirit or a soul, the soul of the Twin Cities is surely felt strongest near the Mississippi River. And along that same pathway, you'll see the City House, a restored grain elevator, formerly known as the St. Paul Municipal Elevator, and Sack House, built in 1927. It's now a seasonal eatery, restaurant, wide open to the river. It's a great place. Stop by, bring your kids. There's lots of games. There's wonderful displays inside explaining the structure's historical significance, which stands as a reminder of St. Paul's history as a port city. In my opinion, no tour of St. Paul is complete without visiting New York Lake Eagle, a one-ton icon of St. Paul's past. I love it. I love her so much. She's a mother digging her talons into a serpent to protect her nest of eaglets, as we mothers would. Anyone here know where this is located? Yeah, this is right at that triangle-shaped park, over the park in the Summit Hill neighborhood. So she originally stood downtown St. Paul at the third-story entrance of the New York Light building. And then that when that was destroyed in 1967, she was nearly discarded. She was placed by a parking lot on a little pedestal, and then there were headlines trying to get rid of her, somebody to take her. And they finally moved her to the Serene Spa in 2004. Just a great place to rest while gawking at mansions. Now time to head over to the Minneapolis riverfront, where you'll find at least a handful of venues and sites featured in the Twin Cities. The story of Minneapolis, of course, begins with the Falls of St. Anthony, the only true waterfall in Mississippi, where water power, river transportation, railroads all came together to turn this into a milling epicenter in the mid-1800s. It's important to note that before Father Lewis Hamilton, the first European to visit the falls in 1680, took it upon himself to rename them after his patron saint. The Dakota people, who had been gathering for generations prior to that, had many other names for the waterfall. The place name I'm most familiar with is Oamina, which translates to turbulent, falling, or swirling waters. This is of course, the falls are nothing like they once were. This is a picture from 1786. 12,000 years ago, before they, no, wasn't 12 that, but 12,000 years ago, before they slowly eroded from their original location, closer to now what's downtown St. Paul. They were 2,700 feet across, 170 feet high, and you could hear their roar from. I personally think that one of the best things you can do while visiting Minneapolis is walk along the 2-mile heritage loop that surrounds the area. I often start at First Bridge Park. So this picture is taken from when I'm walking down Hennepin Bridge Park to Hennepin Bridge to First Bridge Park, where I often park. And here is at the bottom of the stairs. First Bridge Park is the site of the first bridge to cross the Mississippi River anywhere. The first bridge opened. That first bridge was built in 1855. There it is. It was a 620-foot long wooden suspension bridge that stretched from the west bank to Euclid Island. The bridge was considered one of the most elegant engineered structures in the country at the time. Crossing the bridge required tolls to be paid. A lone pedestrian would pay 3 cents, but if you had a horse or a mule with you, you'd have to pay 15 cents for each. Versus if you had a pig or sheep, it was only 2 cents. That first bridge quickly deteriorated and was replaced by a succession of 3 other bridges, including the current bridge, constructed in 1990. Beneath the current bridge are cables and anchors from the bridge's predecessors, discovered during archaeological excavations in the 1980s. Interpretive markers and etchings at the park highlight the site's history. You'll also find a very small tribute to Spirit Island, that was once located in the area, place where Dakota people gathered to pray and women gave birth before the island was quarried for limestone to help build Minneapolis. That's south of block from First Bridge Park, and you'll run into Mill Ruins Park, the site of the first sawmill, grist mill, built by Fort Snelling soldiers in the 1820s, and where Minneapolis became the world's flour milling capital by 1880. The park opened in 2001 as a great homage to the industrial roots of the city. It's a treasure trove of mill ruins that were completely entombed beneath sand and gravel until the 1980s when excavations began. Another view from a different angle. You get right up close to the ruins. And at the heart of it is Mill City Museum, built into the jagged ruins of the Washburn Crosby A mill. In 1874, Todd Wilder Washburn, founder of the dynasty that's in General Mills, built the Washburn A mill. 4 years later, spark ignited, creating a huge explosion, destroyed much of the riverfront and claimed 18 minutes. 2 years later, the mill was rebuilt, and soon leading the flour world in flour, producing enough to make 12 million loaves a day. The mill closed in 1965, remaining vacant for a couple of decades. A devastating fire gutted the abandoned mill in 1991. So many fires in our history. And shortly thereafter, the Minnesota Historical Society announced plans to build a museum in their own. This museum is truly a gem. Such a great museum, a national historic landmark where you can explore the city's milling history. In February 2023, it was voted the 4th best history museum in the country. You can take a freight elevator ride at the structure known as the Flour Tower, during which machines come back to life. Voices of former workers narrate the story of the mill. The museum's lighthearted cinematic tour through 400 years of the area's history, narrated by the humorous Captain Klein, is a must-see. While you're there, you might as well meander next door to the Guthrie Week. For free, you can climb up to the endless bridge that jets out 50 feet above. It's one of the best views of the Mississippi River. Anywhere, it's open to the public throughout the week. Before we cross over the Stone Arch Bridge, just visit a couple places on the East Bank. This is real nearby to, the former Milwaukee Road Depot, now home to the Renaissance Hotel and connecting residents. It's a super fun stop. Many of us will forever call it just the depot. I grew up ice skating at that magical rink. Big ice skated in that rink. Did you? Oh my gosh, that was one of my favorite things to go do as a little girl. It used to be a house inside the former train shed, which is now a ballroom. Completed in 1899, this depot replaced an earlier version constructed in 1879. And the only remaining structure from the original depot is the attached freight house, which is now a really cool Gun Brothers coffee house. Spent at least an hour exploring its corridors, and it was great fun. This was actually kind of during COVID, so it was pretty sparse. But there's beautiful wide open space for lots and lots of historical displays. My favorite are the ghost statues scattered all throughout it that depict actual true narratives of the rail workers, and now signs telling their story. There's Charlie, the rail car waiter, and the shoe shine boy, and Vivian, the women's suffrage advocate. And my favorite is the kissing couple. And they're all true stories. The last train departed from here in 1971. It truly is a monument to those romantic, adventurous rail days gone by. For nearly 7 decades, this was the place where the website says ambition set forth, destinies converged, and hopes became. We have time just enough now to cross over the Stone Arch Bridge, built by James J. Hill for his Great Northern Railroad. The bridge opened in 1883. It is the second oldest bridge to cross the Mississippi River. Eads Bridge in St. Louis was the first. Here's the bridge in 1929. It was transformed into a pedestrian walkway in 1994. After walking across the bridge, you'll pass by the newly renovated Father Hennepin Park and hit the main drag of the area, historic Main Street. This cobblestone patch of it just passed the former Pillsbury Mill, once the largest flour mill in the world. Here feels a little bit like we step back into time. Tourism was a big draw here before the Civil War. Back in the mid 1850s, you could take a 10-cent torchlight boat ride through caves beneath the street. Tourists could relax in mineral springs near the Stone Arch Bridge. A lot of croquet happening. The Main Street is part of Marcy Homes neighborhood, well documented as Minneapolis' oldest neighborhood. Not quite as quiet as St. Paul's folks neighborhood. The neighborhood was originally named the town of St. Anthony Falls, founded in 1857, later merged with Minneapolis in 1872. Those of you who've been here for a while remember what a festive marketplace this area was in the 1990s, or the River Place, which all began when architect Peter Nelson revived the old abandoned red brick Crockman building. That all was short-lived. I heard it was parking issues, but the street has gone through tough times since. One point it felt like a ghost town, but it seems to be gaining a fun and attractive vibe once again. Astor Cafe, housed there on the right, is the oldest masonry building in Minneapolis. Actually used to house the hardware store where Mr. Pillsbury got his start. Across the street from Astor Cafe, Swatter Park. It offers great views of the falls, and great information signs. This celebrates the location of the first commercial hydroelectric plant in the United States. Once you reach the end of Main Street, you can either keep going another block, take left on Hennepin Avenue Bridge to finish the Heritage Loop, where we started at First Bridge Park, or you can take a little detour and cross over the historic Marion Street Bridge to Nicollet Island. Right after you cross that bridge, you see Nicollet Island in. This was originally home to Sash and Door Company, one of the two industrial structures that survived a massive fire in 1884 that swept through the island in northeast Minneapolis. The building at one point also served as a Salvation Army men's homeless shelter. On the pathway next to the inn is a replication of a 2,000-year Dakota bell, Dotaku bell, known as Bell of Two Friends, gifted to Minneapolis by Ibaraki, a sister city of ours in Japan. You can actually ring the bell as you walk through it. And it's said that every time the bell is rung, 2 prayers are sent. One for the friendship of the peoples of Minneapolis and Ibaraki for world peace. Right next to Nicollet Island Inn is Island Road. That leads you to the north side of Nicollet Island. Have we all toured Nicollet Island or walked through it? Such a fascinating place. I feature it in Secret Twin Cities, mentioned in Elvis Twin Cities, but a magical place. You feel like you're back in time. Trails, bridges, abandoned railroad tracks, and preserved Victorian houses on cobblestone streets. It's just a quaint little getaway in the city, well worth exploring. On the far north end of the island, you'll come across to the staircase and go down and cross the bridge, and it takes you right to the mountain where you see in all the postcards from Minneapolis. And, that's just a glimpse. That's my slideshow. So I save time for any questions you have. You can come up and ask questions at the table.
What are some of the weird
The weirdest, well, that's one of the weirdest that I love the most. I put it as the first story is Hot Sam's Antique Park, and I not only loved it because it's so weird, but also because it has such an enduring story to it. And you go there, and it's all these huge props that that are often rented for movies. But you have this giant Tweety bird that's taller than this room in a cage, and it's spaceships and aliens and hippie vans. I mean, it just goes on and on. And the owner, I can't remember the year he opened it, and I've got so many stories and dates flowing through my brain, but he created it for his mother Gladys, who was a record-breaking race car driver. And she had to stop racing to help care for her husband had a brain injury. And so he built her this wonderland. They were both like junk collectors. And so he built this wonderland for her, and they lived there. That giant hardware, everything's for sale or rent there, except for there's this giant hardware hanging sign. That's the only thing that's not. He won't sell that. Anyway, they're just a fun couple to go visit. So that was the epitome of all the weird, wonderful, obscure. Yeah.
Where was it?
That's in it's the first one here. Well, you'll see when you drive along I-35 heading north near Lakeville, you start to see these big weird sculptures on the side of the road up on a hill. And that's part of Hot Sam. So you have to take the next exit and curve around and take a gravel road to get there. But I must have driven by that. My sister was in Montana, so I must have driven 100 times without stopping to see it until I started writing this book. I'm like, I ain't gonna go check out to see what that's about. That's what happens. You just drive by these places and you just are too busy to go in and see if you start writing a book. And you have to find places including your book. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of lighthearted stories in here. you know, the giant snowman that you all know about. You know, to very complex ones like the little commemorative plaza that pays tribute to the Rondo neighborhood, legendary Black neighborhood that was lost in construction by '94. But I think people know about the plaza that honors that, and you know, the city's attic. I got to go up inside the Minneapolis City Hall attic, inside the clock tower. You know, I mean, who knew that there was a multi-layer like library of historical books, this fat, crinkly pages stored in there, kind of thing. Phelan Park, there's a Scrapes pavilion here that we traded to China. We gave them a bunch of Charlie Brown peanut statues in exchange for this beautiful thing. So we got a good deal.
Are there certain locations that you were hoping to put in the book and then something happened? I mean, you mentioned there have been so many fires and certain things have been rebuilt, but then probably there's certain things that haven't. Is there anything that you're like, man, I wish that was still around?
Well, the ones that come to mind are the ones that happened because of COVID and the civil uprising following George Floyd. I mean, you know, actually, yeah, I can keep checking to make sure, is this still open? Because if it closed, I took it out of the book. I wanted this to be living history. And there are places I had to, you know, pluck out. But I was like, at the last minute, I was waiting for like the oldest sci-fi bookstore in Minneapolis that was burned down. Those during the civil uprising, burned to the ground. And he started a fundraising, and yes, he rebuilt it in time for the book. He rebuilt them. And then there was the oldest Chinese bakery. They shut down at the last minute just because they were done. So I had to pull that at the last minute, you know. But you know, I mean, there were places long, the fires for the most part were long ago. We all have fireproof buildings now, so it's not happening as much anymore. So yeah.
Do you have anything in the works for, I know you just finished the book, you probably want to take a breath. Do you have any other projects in mind for the future?
Not book wise, but I never dreamed I'd write a second one after I wrote Secret Twin Cities. A year later, I'm back at it. So yeah, like you said, I just gave birth. So we'll see. Yeah, we'll see. I do a lot of editing on the side and other kinds of writing. This was
My question was related.
they approach me. That'd be fun. I could just live in Stillwater for a while and write a book. I'm going to be an empty nester in 1 year. Maybe I can do anything I want.
Any other questions? Going once, going twice. Thank you so much for coming today.